Hello everyone, my name is India and I am the History Rescuer. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the truth behind the mummy's curse. The idea of mummies and mummies' curses is sort of a staple of the classic monster genre. It is up there with Frankenstein and Dracula and zombies, and it plays into those sorts of cultural tropes. But the origin of that story actually comes from quite a bit further back than you would think. The myth itself was popularized in the 1930s when Tutankhamun, of course, the most famous mummy discovery of all time, occurred, and then a few mere months later, the benefactor and the lord who was sort of overseeing the whole thing, Lord Carnarvon, he died, and that sort of sparked in the media this, feverish slew of, mummies' curse theories and who will die next, and it really sort of took over the cultural mindset. However, it didn't stem from that point in time, and so if it didn't stem from then, I think we need to sort of go all the way back. If you look into ancient Egyptian culture and into the spiritualism behind all of that, into the mythology, you find that the idea of reanimation doesn't really exist within that culture in the sense that people weren't looking to become reanimated. So the idea that the mummy chases you down the hole and you end up cursed for all eternity because you've disturbed it, that they didn't want to be brought back. That was sort of the whole aim. In fact, people would spend an incredible amount of money and an incredible amount of time ensuring that their spirits wouldn't want to hang around. That was done by producing objects like model houses to put inside tombs so that they would have somewhere to live during the afterlife, and the concept of ushabtis, which are small figurines that represented slaves or servants that would work for you in your household, or laborers that would work your fields, and they would set up these complex miniature households essentially so that they would live in the lap of luxury for all of eternity. And so they didn't want to be coming back. There wasn't a need to come back. In saying that, there are representations of some curses on tomb walls, but those curses are usually things along the lines of the council of the gods will bring holy retribution upon you, or you will be eaten by the hippos and the crocodiles of the Nile. It was those sorts of things rather than I will rise from my tomb and bring swift death upon you. That classic sort of 1930s and then revamped, Brendan Fraser style 90s sort of notion of a mummy coming to life. It didn't exist in ancient times. However, if you're thinking about Tutankhamun in particular, his tomb did contain a royal seal, which was sort of closed over the final tomb door, and that was how they knew that the tomb was undisturbed, because they actually had to break that clay seal in order to enter the tomb. And the royal seal in itself was sort of meant to be a deterrent for grave robbers, and most tombs that we have discovered today were already previously robbed in ancient times. Usually those sorts of robberies were inside jobs for tomb builders, and they were the ones who were most likely to go back in and take things afterwards. Moral of the story, the ancients didn't have this idea of mummies leaping out of their graves and chasing you down. So if it didn't come from ancient times, I think it's important that we figure out where it did come from. Which of course brings us way forward into the future, in which we look at the Napoleonic War period. Now, you're looking in the Napoleonic era and, that Regency era at people who are embracing this neoclassical sort of revival, and the women are dressing in high-waisted gowns so that they looked more columnesque and more like the Grecian statues, and people had collections of all of this Romanesque and Grecian things. People were building fake temples and then aging them falsely with acids and things like that so that they would look like they were Roman temples and Grecian temple ruins on their own properties. That was a really popular thing for lords and ladies to do, to make their gardens. It was the newest gazebo or backyard barbecue. The Napoleonic era was like a huge sort of plundering period for Egypt. The French were pulling things out of tombs and out of temples and scribbling their names inside the pyramids, and you know, it is a period that is referred to as the Rape of Egypt. However, when the Napoleonic forces lost to England, a lot of those treasures were actually transferred over into British clutches, and this new era of Egyptomania started for the British. And part of that was this fascination with the barrier between life and death, and this perception that this was a culture, this ancient culture that straddled life and death. And you know, the mummies really exemplified this idea of the sacred and the profane sort of meeting together. There was this immortality sort of idea tied up with that. And so, you know, this in itself inspired notable authors like Louisa May Alcott, who we all know as the author of Little Women, and several other notable individuals, both French and English, to write a number of very creepy sort of pieces about, you know, the first sort of Egyptian artifacts, bringing curses back to England. It's arguable that the mummy myth was sort of stemming from this European colonialist insecurity or concern that these cultures and these ancient artifacts that they had taken and plundered and desecrated, it was this idea that those cultures and, you know, that history would rise up and sort of take back what was theirs in this bloody sort of fashion. And you know, that really resonated throughout the era, and it continues to kind of resonate now. This notion though that things would rise up, and you know, this fascination with spiritual entities and the arcane and the obscure, it was really exacerbated by sort of the late Victorian era, which in itself came about as a result of, you know, great changes in technology, and people were starting to look towards, you know, the invisible realm in order to try and justify their own existences. So the level of spiritualist sentiment was kind of exacerbated by the onset of World War I and the massive losses that everyone experienced on all sides of the war. Sort of really brought home that need to link life and death. So this grey area, this sort of public sentiment that life and death weren't so far away from each other, it really sort of formed a melting pot for the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922. And when Howard Carter opened it up, it sent the press into a frenzy. And then, of course, with it being under such close scrutiny, the subsequent demise of Lord Carnarvon, so close to the actual opening and the entering of the tomb, ended up sending the press into even more of a fever pitch, and all these allegations that the tomb was cursed and who was going to be next, and all these sorts of wild things started to develop. And that's really what prompted a lot of the inspiration for later films like The Mummy and The Mummy Returns and Curse of the Mummy, and all of those fantastic 1930s capers that we all know and love. So yeah, ultimately the Curse of the Mummy isn't based in history so much, or it's based in history, but it's not based on ancient Egyptian history. It is based on late Regency into Victorian era stories and sort of makeshift lore that was created by colonialist entities and European authors, and then fed into by a select number of actual deaths that occurred, and then fed by the press. So that's it. Thank you so much for joining me. Please feel free to like and subscribe and share if this is something that is at all interesting to you. I'm going to be talking about a number of more interesting fun facts and anecdotal history, and just sort of trying to unpack and explore under-recognized areas of history so that people can appreciate them more. I'm India, and this is the History Rescuer.